Hey, welcome back, listeners. It's great to have you back on with the Complete Solution Group. We got part three with Chuck DeMore. We're talking about kind of old school Border Patrol and what was going on there in the 80s into the 90s and early 2000s. And, Chuck's got some great stories from when he was in the patrol. And, for those of you who don't know kind of the history of the Border Patrol, I mean, it's got a great, glamorous history. There's been a few movies that have been done on the Border Patrol. We talked to Chuck about that in episode one. And, of course, these movies take a lot of, kind of practical licensing and kind of expand upon some things that happen. But what was going on down at the border back in the drug interdiction days of the 80s and up until now with these huge cartels that are happening. It's great that we have Chuck on the show. And Chuck, we're just going to break into kind of like what was going on in Brownsville when you were there, and what you saw and kind of the drug interdiction and the bandits coming across and people trafficking a lot of dope.
Yeah, sure. When I when I entered on duty, John, it was December, I guess, of 1983. I'd just come back from the academy. And again, I joined the Border Patrol just because it sounded like something interesting and exciting. And maybe if I didn't like it, I could use the experiences to go back and be a better teacher. But once I joined, I found that I loved it. And there was a tremendous number of things you can do. So during my 5 years in uniform in the Border Patrol at Brown Field in California, I was able to serve 3 terms on the Border Crime Prevention Unit. John, you refer to that as the Bandit Detail. And that was a team that was put together in, I want to say, the very late 70s initially. There's a book, Lines and Shadows, by Joseph Wambaugh, where he chronicles the team. And it was put together by Border Patrol agents and San Diego police officers who joined together to combat what was identified as a significant issue at the time. That was bandit activity, or what we refer to as border bandits. They were generally illegal aliens, but not always. They were generally working right on the American side of the border and robbing the aliens as they crossed. And if you think about the volume of people that we were dealing with back then, and I think John talked about, we would catch maybe 100 people on a shift, or we would catch 100, 200, 300, and sometimes more on a shift. But there were literally thousands of people crossing that border, even back then in the early 80s. And if you only take $1 from everybody you encounter, but you encounter 100 people that night, you're a bandit, at $100, that's a lot of money, especially in those days in Mexico. It's still a lot of money, but it was a tremendous amount of money for them. And so there were a lot of what we call border bandits, generally working right at the border, because if they got interdicted by law enforcement, they could jump right across the line. So they were very difficult to apprehend, and they were generally just robbing people as they crossed the border. The bandits never really came much into the interior because it would be too difficult for them to get away if they were detected. So they worked right on that border area. Well, in the 5 years that I was at Brown Field from 1983 to 88, we had 5 Border Patrol agents at my station that were shot. And so it was a very, very dangerous time. I was physically present at 5 shootings in those 5 years in San Diego. Only one that I was involved in, fired my own weapon. But it was very, very common to engage the border bandits, in close proximity to the border, and you never knew when that was going to happen. And so because the line agents would often get involved in something that they didn't anticipate until it was a little bit too late for them to take the precautions that they otherwise would, the government decided to put together a team to go in and specially try and interdict these people. So they reconstituted the border crime team in about 1983 or 4. And it was comprised of half Border Patrol agents, half San Diego police. You would go out on foot in 2 teams of 5, patrolling with 2 vehicles as your backup and your communications coordination if necessary. So you'd have 1 police officer in a San Diego police vehicle, 1 Border Patrol agent in a Border Patrol vehicle, parked in proximity to where the teams would deploy into the canyons and go on foot. And the agents were always, and the police officers were always looking to interdict the border bandits. And so that was a very, very common phenomena at that time. But that was back at a time when we had, I think, better relations with the Mexican government, at least in terms of the border and controlling the border, because we would be able to work with the Mexican authorities through our communication systems to support us when we would interdict people right at the border that would jump back across. So we were able to become much more effective that way. I don't think that's taking place today. I don't even know that the border bandit activity today is as significant as it was back then, because it's not because there's any more honor amongst the bad guys, but I think now it's just much easier to make money doing other things than taking $1 from every alien that you encounter. And there are so many more people coming today from so many different countries, people who have so much more in the way of resources that they can pay smugglers higher fees. So the cartels, obviously, as we see today, they move with impunity. They can move people with impunity. They can move narcotics with impunity. And scarily enough, they can move other contraband with impunity. So, and I don't think they have any scruples. They're going to move whatever they get paid to move. So, provided that someone comes to them and asks them to move something that would do us great harm, I think they'd have no problem getting it moved. But the border has been out of control for a long time. It's just that at that time we had direct, ability to impact it in a favorable way as agents. Now the agents don't have any ability to favorably impact the border situation. They're being told, to process in these tents, feed and bathe and or feed and house and so forth. All these thousands of people that are crossing. I went down to Yuma recently and went through the tent cities, and it was just mind-boggling, the numbers of people that are coming across. And for people to be critical of the Border Patrol is outrageous, because they have absolutely no ability to do a better job than they're doing, and it's amazing that they're doing as good as a job as they are doing. But yeah, the border at Brownfield has been was a very dangerous place. And I think that the efforts of the administration back then, at least if not effective, were well intended. With 2,000 agents, you can only do so much. But 19,000 now, if we had the same administrative follow through today that we had back then, with 20,000 agents now and not 2,000, you'd see that border, I think, very well protected.
Yeah, Chuck,
you had 2,000 agents, now you got 20,000. And I think we did a better job with 2,000 then than we're doing with 20,000 today.
Yeah. And I just want to hit one point that you made, Chuck. I mean, you brought up that a lot of people are getting on the Border Patrol agents because, they watch the news and they see a Border Patrol agent helping somebody out of the river and bringing them up on our side. And what they're not realizing is that person's already in the United States. Like the Constantina Wire is not the border of the United States. The border is actually before the Constantina Wire. And the other thing is, like, these agents are doing what they can. And, I hear a lot of people, especially on X and some of the other platforms, say, well, they should just quit. They should just quit. They're traitors to the United States because they're not doing their job. They're not traitors to the United States. Look, they have a job to do. They're trying to do the best that they can. They're falling under the rules and authorities of a president that does not want to secure the border. If they were to just get up and quit, we would be even less secure than we are now. I mean, these men and women are trying. They raise their right hand. They want to do the right thing. They want to be out there arresting bandits, stopping drug smuggling, keeping people from being sexually trafficked. They want to do those things. That's what people become a Border Patrol agent for. They become a Border Patrol agent because they want to secure the United States and make the United States safer. They don't want to be babysitting thousands of illegal migrants and processing them into the interior of the United States and having American citizens come down on them on all these social media platforms and talking crap about them the whole time. It just, really kind of just, it stiffens my spine a little bit. And I get a little pissed off when I start to hear people just, saying bad stuff about these Border Patrol agent men and women when they're working 12-hour shifts, dealing with horrific situations, and there's no help in sight for them.
Oh, John, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you keep your self-respect in the Border Patrol these days, but obviously, until we have control of the border, we're not going to have control of the interior. Until we properly resource the Border Patrol, we're not going to have control of the border. Until we have the ability or the political will to enforce the laws that we already have on the books, we're not going to control the border. And if we don't control the border, you're going to see more people ending up in the interior in your community, throughout the United States. We're going to see more and more consequences of the lack of attention to the border. And it's not a difficult situation to resolve. And I think there are some real fixes. I don't think people are getting well educated in terms of what those fixes might entail. And so people are generally fearful of what's happening at the border, but unaware or unsure of what to do about it. And my advice would be get rid of the people that have demonstrated an inability over the last number of years not to do anything about it, and start putting people in office that will do something about it.
And Chuck, you brought up a good point where, what happens at the border makes it into the interior. And then, like you just said, you spent 5 years in Brownfield. And after that, you made a segue. What was your next pit stop in your career?
For Brownfield, I went to Los Angeles anti-smuggling. And it was a natural kind of progression because the aliens, the migrants that were coming in across the San Diego border in those days, where 95% of them were right up to I-5 to LA, and from LA, to the airport and go wherever they're going. So the anti-smuggling group in Los Angeles was essentially kind of an extension of the Border Patrol, really. Worked very closely with the uniform guys to identify the drop houses in Los Angeles that were being used to, hold these people until their smuggling fees had been paid. And I don't know if all of your listeners are aware of the distinction. You hear a lot of talk in the media today about alien smuggling and about trafficking and the differences between the two. In trafficking, there must be an element of force, fraud, or coercion. Generally, it's in indentured servitude or in the sex trade. And so those people are truly victims. They are being subjugated by the traffickers. Their passports are usually withheld. Smuggling is a little different situation. Smuggling is when the person who wants to come into the United States makes a financial arrangement with the smuggler to get transported in. The monies were not ever paid until the alien was already in the United States. So you would meet your smuggler at the bus depot, for example, in Tijuana. You would make arrangements to get smuggled to Los Angeles. At that time, it was $300. That was a standard fee for a Mexican. Other than Mexicans, El Salvadorans, Guatemalans would be more expensive. But $300, you'd make the arrangements at the bus depot in Tijuana to get smuggled to Los Angeles. They would generally cross you either on foot to a waiting vehicle or cross you in a vehicle in remote areas east of San Diego, find their way to the highway, up the highway to Los Angeles, circumventing or waiting until the checkpoint in San Clemente would be down, up the 5 to Los Angeles. You would be held in a house there. Obviously, you're held. You're not free to come and go. You're held in that house. And when you would get to that house, the smugglers would know where you were going and when you got to where you were going, who you were going to meet up with, and that person was responsible for your smuggling fee. So you make arrangements voluntarily at the bus depot. You get smuggled to a house in Los Angeles. You give them your cousin's name and phone number in New Jersey. They contact that person. That person wires the money to Los Angeles, and then they take you to the airport, drop you off, and off you go to New Jersey. Smuggling was and is a very lucrative business arrangement for the smugglers. It's not the same as trafficking, so you have to draw that distinction. You have both. You have trafficking, you have smuggling. Smuggling still takes place in enormous volumes, and they use every method conceivable to do that. Had an opportunity to go to, when I was in Los Angeles, aboard a Coast Guard cutter, the Sherman, the United States Coast Guard cutter Sherman, and we actually interdicted a Chinese smuggling vessel with, I think, about 130 Chinese nationals aboard it. Interdicted that vessel in the San Diego area and ultimately escorted it to Guatemala, where we repatriated the Chinese nationals through the Guatemalan diplomatic corps back to China. So smuggling, trafficking, smuggling of contraband, smuggling of narcotics, everything that crosses that border is generally destined for somewhere else. And so when the people would cross, they would be destined for places in the interior, almost always go through Los Angeles. So I went to Los Angeles, did the smuggling thing for about 5 years. We ended up in some major smuggling operations. Most of them coming from Mexico into the United States. We also identified some networks that were bringing people from India and transiting through a whole host of countries before they would get here. And that's another one of the things that's so difficult to kind of digest, is this difference between policy and practice, because we have very defined policies on asylum seeking. And generally, when you're seeking asylum and you leave the country that you claim you're being persecuted in and you travel through other countries, if you travel through a safe one, you're supposed to file for asylum there and not country shop. And that's what virtually everyone does. Everyone's country shopping, and generally the end country is the United States. So you'll leave India, or you'll leave somewhere in Africa or Asia and transit through Germany and the UK and maybe Canada and then into the United States. And all those countries are safe third-party countries. So we have policies in place that prohibit this, but our practices allow for it. So when you're, incongruent there, you're going to suffer the same stresses that we're all suffering today.
And Chuck, so how many years were you in Los Angeles on ASU?
In Los Angeles, about 6 years.
And then after that, where did you head to?
After that, I decided I was going to take a little bit of a break. So I transferred to Honolulu.
What happens in Honolulu? Well, actually, this time was when Magnum was on. So did you get run out there to Tom Selleck while you were there doing your job?
That opportunity, but I did spend 2 years there as the deputy. And in Honolulu, it was like, no border, no significant domestic problems there. Our biggest workload were Japanese tourists coming into the islands from Japan. So the inspections process was the biggest part of the operation. Back then, it was the INS. So you had inspections, and then your adjudications, and detention, and investigations. So in San Diego, for example, Border Patrol is huge. Investigations is huge. Detention and removal is huge. In Hawaii, they're not so big. In Hawaii, it's inspections. So I spent 2 years there, and then decided to come back, and came back as the deputy, the number 2 guy for the San Francisco office. And spent about 2 years as the deputy, and then my former boss left, went to Los Angeles, so I got that job in San Francisco, the district director job. And that was a pretty big job. I mean, we had about 1,100 employees. We serviced 49 of the northern 58 California counties. We did everything on the benefits and the enforcement side. So that director position involved dealing a lot with local elected officials, national elected officials, met a lot with the city folks in San Francisco who were never very happy with what they were getting out of their immigration, network. They would have liked to have seen it operate a lot differently, but we were very comfortably coexisting, the enforcement part of INS in a city like San Francisco. So to go back to your issue, John, of them declaring themselves a sanctuary city, never really meant much to us. You can declare yourself a sanctuary city, but because of the supremacy clause, we're still going to conduct our business in accordance with the laws of the United States of America, and we did that. And we got a little bit of pushback, but we're going to do the right thing. That's what we're entrusted to do. That's what the American people expect of us, and that's what we did. And then from San Francisco, we all know what happened on 9/11, and that's my fear today, that we're letting in people that are comfortable or may endorse what happened here on 9/11. And about a year after that, maybe not even a year after that, I got a call from my then boss who said, well, it's time to come to Washington, D.C. and help out here. And so I really didn't want to do that. And I remember when we had our last discussion, he had offered me a couple of jobs in D.C. And I said, listen, boss, I'm greatly thankful that, I know that you have confidence in me that I could do the job for you, but I gotta say no, I gotta stay in San Francisco. And he told me I didn't really have that choice. So from San Francisco, went to Washington, D.C. and 2002 as the assistant commissioner for investigations. And about 4 or 5 months, if that, after I got to DC, my then boss, same guy, called me up to his office and said, "Hey, hate to tell you this, but the INS is going to be abolished, and we're going to be standing up a new whole agency, and I don't really want to be a part of that in the long term, so I'm going to retire." So I spent the next year or so in headquarters as the INS rep to the Homeland Security Working Group. So I attended a weekly meeting at the old executive building on counterterrorism that was attended by all of the agency heads, both civilian and military, to address the need to support the government in such a way to protect ourselves from any further attacks and to identify anyone in the country who may be sympathetic to those attacks and see what we can do about that. For about a year and a half in DC, and it was a rough go, really. It was when we saw the abolishment of the INS, standing up of Homeland Security, and my boss, same guy, called me up one day to the office and said, I think it was the 7th floor, whatever, headquarters, and he said, "I got some good news and some bad news." And I said, "Well, what's the good news?" He said, "Well, the good news is you're going to be the INS working group rep on the department's Homeland Security team, so that's going to be really exciting." I said, "Oh, what's the bad news?" He said, "Well, you got to do your old job too." So, but that was a real eye-opener, and that's when Asa Hutchinson was the Undersecretary for Border and Transportation Security. That's when the Air and Marine Wing was in ICE, not in CBP. It was when we first stood the department up. Tom Ridge was the secretary, wonderful guy. Really enjoyed working with him, for him. But that was really exciting. I mean, it was exciting and it was tough, both, because you got to see the creation of a department, got to participate in the standing up of the Department of Homeland Security and the creation of ICE. But going through those growing pains was extraordinarily stressful. You had all these people in customs, all these people in immigration, and you had to create a single footprint and force everybody together, creating one culture from two, one set of, the blog. I mean, what do they call it? The branding, the flags, the challenge coins, everything changed. And as you know, John, and John, from being in the service for so long, in the government for so long, you begin to really internalize your symbols, the INS flag and the symbols and the mission. And, there's a lot that goes into that, and you internalize that and you become part of it. And to tear that down and stand up a new agency with a new flag and a new mission and a new culture and new people, very difficult to do. And I think the growing pains were extraordinarily tough in the first few years. I think now we're beginning to see it mature, but we need some adult leadership to help to ensure that when it matures, it goes in the right direction.
Yeah, I was at the academy then. I was an academy instructor, actually. So I had come into the service as an INS officer, and then I was at the academy in 2003 when INS became ICE. So I remember putting the INS guidon away and the new guidon being the ICE guidon, and our new troops down there. We had one class in INS uniforms and one class in the new ICE uniforms. So yeah, it was a definite, big, huge transition, even there at the academy. And Chuck, for one thing, like I don't really believe that it all really worked out. I mean, I think the thought concept was good, but I really felt like under INS we connected more with each other, like with with what was then inspections and what was then CIS, the benefit side, like we had much more interaction and worked better together with ICE, with the INS OI working. I just feel like when we separated and everyone became kind of their own agency, I think we lost something. How do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. As the INS district director, I had the ability to do deconfliction between the benefit side and the enforcement side, because sometimes they're some competitive issues there, but also between various branches on the enforcement side. So the investigations branch, they're out doing their thing. The detention and deportation branch is going to be the receiver of the investigation apprehensions. They have to ensure that they're properly monitored and detained until such time as they're removed, and then ensure an effective removal, right? All of that could be deconflicted by the director. You had one field manager responsible for the entire immigration portfolio. Well, when they stood up, and that was under the INS paradigm, when they stood up Homeland Security, there was a lot of discussion about that, and there were a lot of parochial kinds of feelings among the senior managers in the INS. So the detention guy said, well, I don't want to answer to investigations. I don't want to answer to, I want to control my own portfolio. And so the investigations branch said the same thing. Well, of course, the benefits side was moved out to another agency. So there's no local deconfliction. And having been a district director and having been a special agent in charge, I can see clearly the ability that the director position had, the ability to do that local deconfliction, and then the inability that the special agent in charge had to be to manage the detention or removal side, had no control over it. So that lack of deconfliction means that the two parties can kind of run at their own pace in their own way. That's what you have in ICE. Or that's what you have rather in Homeland Security. You've got ICE, you've got CIS, and you've got CBP, and they're all run by different people. And I'm sure they're all collegiate with one another, and they all try and work well with one another. But when push comes to shove, they all have their own priorities, and they're going to work toward their own priority, right? Yeah. So that lack of local deconfliction, and as a special agent in charge, as a new one back in 2003, we brought that to the attention of the then head of the agency and said, this is a significant problem that needs to be addressed. And the then person who was in charge of, putting out a response to that was put out a very weak position paper on it saying, well, in case of deconfliction, do your best to work it out amongst yourselves. This is essentially what it said. And we were, well, okay. And now we see what the result of that is. In my view, it's better when there's the capacity for deconfliction by a single person. And let's face it, I don't think the Secretary of Homeland Security is getting into the weeds enough, or the Deputy Secretary into the weeds enough to know what kind of deconfliction needs to take place and how to achieve that deconfliction. And as long as you're not going to achieve it, you're going to have competition, not coordination between these components, and you'll never get to a common goal. You never get to an acceptable place.
We really started to see that especially develop in like 2019, when HSI wanted to be totally out of the ICE arena. And you saw that ERO was starting to pick up a lot more of the enforcement activity. They were making a lot more arrests under 922. They were doing some 1324 work. They were, helping with a lot more workforce incitement, work site enforcement. And, so HSI was slowly trying to back their way out of anything that was immigration. They wanted to really be with the transnational criminal organizations and be investigating that type of stuff. And of course, their whole customs portfolio. But you've really started to see that kind of abrasion that was happening between the two enforcement arms that were under ICE. And, that still goes on today.
Couldn't agree with you more. I was so unhappy with that piece of the equation back then. You've got to have defined missions, defined responsibilities, and then everybody has to fall in line. When we first came together, it was an immigration agency, a customs agency, forced together with very little guidance on what our new mission would be. Now, we all knew on the immigration side, it's going to be immigration. On the customs side, and no disrespect at all to my brothers in customs, but they saw their portfolio starting to morph and shrink and change in ways they didn't like. That immigration beast is growing, and other agencies could absorb much of what the customs people had been doing. And I think there was a lot of competition in the beginning. And I think in the early days, management was more inclined to be much more receptive to the interests of the customs side of the house because it was an important historical, agency. And they're trying to find ways to keep that relevant in an immigration agency. And the immigration beast was so unwieldy that, this is just my personal view, the investigations component of ICE didn't want to get just sucked into that immigration, mess and get, to a point where they couldn't do anything but immigration. So they were holding on to their customs portfolio. And of course, the immigration people wanted to expand the immigration portfolio by virtue of all these additional people. And that's my view of what the department, what the Bush administration really wanted. Because when I was on that working group, the very first meeting we had, Asa Hutchinson asked us, he said, I'm going to give you a tasking and I want you to come back next week and answer this question. Would it be better for U.S. Customs and U.S. Border Patrol to merge and be one entity and one shared culture as we move forward in this new Homeland Security, or should we have two, an immigration and a customs? And we both came back, the customs person and myself, because we had been, in discussions with our own agencies, and we both came back and said the same thing. We believe we should be separate. We have distinctly different cultures, distinctly different missions. We have everything's different. The flags, the uniforms, everything's different. And so H. Hutchinson said, okay, now I want you to go back. And next week when you come back, tell me why it would be a good idea to merge these two agencies together. So after we had just made our arguments why it would be a bad idea, the next week we had to come back and argue why it would be a good idea. And of course, the reason it would be a good idea is because I think you had 2,000 immigration special agents and 3,000 customs special agents. Now you have 5,000. 5,000 special agents to deploy in real time to meet emerging national security threats, right? Sounds great, and it is great. You go from 2,000 to 5,000. What wasn't so great, at least in the eyes of some of the people, was, well, that's not the work I signed up to do, the 3,000 on the customs side. I didn't sign up to do immigration work. I don't really want to do immigration work. And on the other side, it was, well, I didn't sign up to do customs work, and it's not really what I want to do, but we didn't have a choice. So that argument prevailed, and we knew that it would. It was the argument they were looking for. It would create a more robust enforcement agency to address emerging national security threats. Well, where are those national security threats most likely to come from? People, people bringing bombs, not bombs coming of their own. So it's people and it's immigration and it's foreign nationals that are generally causing or posing this threat, right? So when they stood up Homeland Security and forced these two agencies together, in many regards, they didn't want to go together. And they liked their missions and they liked their separateness. And so because they were forced together, in the detention and removal component, they were all former immigration guys and ladies. That's what we wanted to do. But in the investigation side, it was 2/3 of us were customs and 1/3 of us were immigration. And so it was a very difficult merge. It was a push and pull. And because the customs components were larger, and they ended up taking more of the senior field positions, a lot more, their arguments early on seemed to carry more weight. And management allowed the investigations branch to kind of move a little bit more and more and more and more until it finally wasn't an immigration investigations component as much as maybe we would have thought it would have become, but it became more of just an amalgam of some immigration stuff and some customs stuff. And so to the point where they didn't even want to be called immigration and customs enforcement. They wanted to be called Homeland Security
Investigation. Yeah.
I was totally opposed to that then. I'm totally opposed to that now. We are, in my view, an immigration agency first and foremost. We're tasked with protecting the border, protecting the interior, protecting Americans, protecting everyone in this country. But to do that, we have to have control of that border. We don't. So get control of it, or get someone who can.
Exactly, and that's a great closing point for us, Chuck. You know, as we're coming into this next election year, and you know, we're fighting over whether we want open borders or secure America. You know, we're going to have to answer a lot of different questions, and you know, there's two totally different opposing sides onto how that situation should be treated. So it'll be a very interesting year to watch. You know, maybe as the election comes closer, and maybe even after next year's election, we'll have you back on, because there will be a bunch of crazy things going on, and some decisions are going to have to be made. Again, Chuck, we really appreciate you coming on. We appreciate you doing 3 episodes with us. It's a lot of time, but you're a really interesting guy and have a lot of knowledge, so we really appreciate you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. We'll definitely talk with you soon. So take care.
All right. Appreciate it, guys.